webinar. So welcome everybody to this, our webinar on measuring ethical culture. All companies have a culture, and every company and every team really has to own that culture. It can be hard to do all of that. And in order to understand whether the culture is what we want and whether it's progressing in the right direction, whether we're achieving the culture that we want to achieve, then we need to measure it. We need to assess it in some way. We need some metrics. And so that's what this discussion is all about today. What different approaches do people take in measuring culture, and what have we learned over the last few years? This has been quite a rapid learning path over the last, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years. We've been focusing a great deal on culture, and boards have been focusing a great deal more on culture, as have regulators and wider stakeholders. So it's a very, very relevant topic. And I'm very pleased to have 3 experts with me today, and I will introduce those in a moment. Just 1 or 2 housekeeping points to begin with. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available afterwards for you to review or indeed share. It'll be on YouTube. So please note that. Please prepare your questions. We've had 1 or 2 in advance, which is great, but we'd love to get your questions as we progress through the webinar. And please put those questions into the Q&A box, not the chat box. It's very important that you put them in the Q&A box, because that's where we'll be looking for those questions. We might miss them if you put them in the chat box. You can put them in anonymously, or you can attach your name to them. But also, it's worth noting that you can vote for the questions you most want answered. Now, that's really helpful from my point of view, because I know what you're most interested in. But it's also quite a nice way of participating and indicating what are the issues of greatest interest to you. We'll use the chat box for any other information to send to you from the organisers, but also if you have any technical issues or difficulties as we go through the webinar, then please do put them into the chat box. We will be live tweeting during the event as well. So please be aware of that, and please also retweet. It's always good in these days, this age of social media, to get as much debate going beyond the confines of the video screen. So please feel free to tweet and retweet and put your messages out there. We'll be using the hashtags hashtag Business Ethics Matters, capital B, capital E, capital M, Business Ethics Matters, no spaces in that, and at IBE UK. Right, enough of all that stuff. Let's move on to introducing our speakers today. So, Alison Cottrell, first of all. Alison is the founding chief executive of the Financial Services Culture Board, which started life as the Banking Standards Board in 2015. Its aim is to help raise standards of behaviour and competence across the financial services sector. And to do that, it provides evidence and information to its members, and also support and challenge. And it's that evidence and measurement and metrics which, of course, Alison is particularly going to focus on today. Alison started life as a city economist, and in 2001 joined Her Majesty's Treasury. And from 2009 to 2015, Alison was Director of Financial Services, but a role she combined with the role of Director of Corporate Services, which focus particularly on staff development and organizational culture. So she's done a bit of culture as well as measuring culture in the or at the Financial Services Culture Board. Oonagh Harpur is one of these sort of serial non-executives, I think it's fair to say. In her time, she's been a chief executive, a chair, and a non-executive in the energy, health, professional services and financial services sectors, both in the UK and in the US. She's currently independent non-executive at KPMG in the UK and a member of their public interest committee. And I know from talking to Oonagh, spends a lot of time thinking about culture and has a lot of interesting things to share with us today. Oonagh's also a qualified business coach, so she knows quite a bit about trying to get the best out of people. Muel Kaptein is Professor in Business Ethics and Integrity at the RSM Erasmus University in Rotterdam. It's a role that he combines with being a partner at KPMG in the Netherlands, supporting clients in developing and assessing their ethics, integrity and compliance. Muel's a real expert in the business ethics field and has done a lot of work on how you measure it, as well as how you develop it and embed it. So it'll be really interesting, Muel, to get your perspective on business ethics and measuring it today. So without further ado, let's move into the session. And we're going to hear from each of our panelists for about 10 minutes each, so roughly half an hour to 35 minutes. And once we have heard from each of them, then we will open up the discussion and deal with some of those questions. So first in line is Alison. No, it's not. It's Muel. I do apologize. I knew I'd get that wrong. See, it's you're so focused on trying to get everything right that you're bound to get it wrong. So no, we've agreed that Muel will go first. So Muel's going to kick off, then Alison, then Oonagh. So Muel, over to you. We look forward to hearing what you have to tell us.
Yeah, thank you, Ian, for this nice introduction. And for me also, I learned from my parents, ladies first, but the ladies decided in advance that I'm to present first. So that's the reason I start. Hello, everyone. Well, it's a real pleasure for me to contribute to this webinar. I support, first of all, the Institute. I support also your work as a compliance and an ethics officer. This is Ethics Matter, and I support the topic of this webinar because, well, I already said that measuring ethical culture is more relevant than ever, but it's also a complex task with a lot of pitfalls, but also challenges. So I feel honored to say a few words about this topic of measuring culture. Well, when we talk about measuring ethical culture, for me at least, but I also face at many organizations, many questions arise. So 4 key questions that I will address in this short 10 minutes presentation is, well, what is the ethical culture to start with? When we have defined ethical culture, what are the dimensions of ethical culture? And when we have defined those dimensions, why should we measure ethical culture at all, and why is so high on the agenda nowadays? And finally, what are methods to measure ethical culture? So 4 key questions that I will address within 4 answers on 4 slides. And I will do that from my perspective. I already introduced myself on the one hand from my work as a professor in the field of business ethics that you can see on the next slide. I wrote my PhD thesis in 1998 about measuring the ethics of organizations, and I've conducted a lot of research into the ethical culture of organizations. And on the other hand, in 1996, I founded a department at KPMG, where we have since then helped hundreds of clients in measuring their ethics, integrity, and compliance. So I want to say something about my experience, but also what I know from scientific research in measuring culture, so both from a scientific point of view and from a practical point of view. So I said 4 questions for now, leading to 4 answers on 4 slides, with, by the way, a final slide at the end. So let's go to the first question, and that's on the next slide indeed. And that's the question, what's the ethical culture of an organization? Well, the main idea is that managers, board members, employees, and their decisions and behaviors are influenced by the context they work in. And the work environment influences their behavior. It's not about just the apples, the ethics of the individuals, but also about the barrel, the ethics of the organization as such. The ethics of the organization is defined in the academic literature, but also in many regulations and laws, as the extent, you can read this on the slide, to which ethical behavior is stimulated, encouraged, and unethical behavior is curbed, discouraged, and prevented. The ethics of an organization, in that sense, consists of, say, on the one hand, a formal part, and on the other hand, an informal part, or the explicit part, or the implicit part, or the hard controls, or the soft controls. And that informal, implicit, soft controls part of the organization is the culture of the organization, or in other terms, the climate of the organization. So the ethical culture is about what people perceive, experience in their work regarding the extent to which they are encouraged to behave in an ethical way. So the ethical culture is about perceptions of those who are part of that culture. But culture is also the patterns in behavior. When, for example, in an organization, people never or hardly voice their concerns or raise their issues, we may conclude or interpret that as that people are stimulated in that organization not to raise their concerns. So people in the organization have an idea about the culture of their organization, but also people outside the organization reading the patterns in the behavior of the people that represent that organization. So having defined briefly, and a lot can be said about that, but just briefly for now, the ethical culture, what are important dimensions of it? So for my PhD research, I collected 150 cases of unethical behavior and analyzed what their organizational causes were. So why did good people do bad things in their work? And I came to 8 dimensions that are shown here, which have been validated by many other scholars, and I also did that myself. And also regulators and auditors are using this model increasingly, and as KPMG we use this model to assess the ethical culture of organizations and also of our own culture, by the way. Given the limited time now, just to describe them very briefly. So first of all, it's about clarity, the extent to which it's clear for people what the values, norms, and standards mean for them. Role modeling, the extent to which managers in the top, but also at the middle, behave visibly in an ethical way. Support of employees, the extent to which employees are motivated to behave in an ethical way. Enabling environment, the extent to which employees have sufficient resources, time, information to behave in an ethical way. Transparency, the extent to which ethical and unethical behavior are visible for those who can act upon that. Openness to discuss dilemmas, the extent to which employees can share their dilemmas they face and that others will listen to them. Comfort to report, especially comfort to report misconduct, the extent to which people in the organization can raise unethical behaviors and can also escalate that. And enforcement, in the end, is the extent to which unethical behavior is punished and ethical behavior is appreciated or even rewarded. And by the way, also the extent to which the organization learns from unethical behavior or even nearby unethical behavior. Well, this model of the ethical culture means that the more these 8 dimensions are embedded, are present in the organization, the more ethical the culture of the organization is, and the lower the risks of unethical behavior? Well, that is the second question and a part of the answer to that second question. Let's go to the third question about why measuring the ethical culture. Well, a lot of information is put on this slide. So let's go first to why ethical culture is important. The right-hand part of this slide gives an overview of the academic studies that show the value of improving the ethical culture. So, for example, having an ethical culture leads to 50% less fraud and theft, but also leads to a better reputation, 25%. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, why is measuring ethical culture important? First, and also by the way, maybe foremost, is that measuring ethical culture is in itself ethical and is an important element of the ethical organization. So by monitoring, assessing, auditing its culture, the organization creates more transparency, which is what I showed on the previous slide, an important dimension of the ethical organization culture. But measuring ethics is ethics, also in the sense of that ethics mean reflection. So measuring means reflection, means ethics. So organizations should measure their ethical culture, and not measuring the ethical culture is currently seen as irresponsible management. But there are also more reasons for why measuring ethical culture is important. As I already referred to, regulators are increasingly requiring organizations to measure their ethical culture. So measuring ethical culture is a must. And when organizations don't do that, regulators all over the world are increasingly also assessing the ethical culture of organizations themselves. But measuring, and it's a third point, is also very helpful. Having measured your own ethical culture means that you are able to define what is sufficient and should be protected, and what is insufficient and should be improved. And so, for example, when the clarity should be improved, organizations can, for example, start to communicate more the values and norms. So each dimension of the culture requires a different set of interventions, tools, and also actions. And by the way, measuring ethical culture is also beneficial. Showing in the left-hand lower corner is the example of our company. I assisted that measured its culture 4 times, and you see every 2 years the culture progresses. And that was also helpful for the organization to show it to its regulators that it worked on its ethical culture and that there was also progress made. And finally, not unimportant, is that measuring ethical culture is also possible. When I started in the early 90s by expressing my ambition and dream even to assess the ethical culture of organizations, people started usually to laugh and responded quite skeptically. But nowadays, tools exist to measure the ethical culture of organizations. Frameworks are existing, and even benchmarking is possible. So, hooray, hooray, we can measure the ethical culture of an organization. Well, then we come and now arrive to the fourth and final question, how to measure ethical culture. Just to mention a few commonly used methods, as the 2 other presenters, the ladies in the panel, will highlight this especially. But conducting interviews, performing task research, running a survey, doing observations, and also conducting root cause analysis are currently commonly used methods to assess or even to measure the ethical culture of an organization. And also what organizations currently are doing is that they don't just use one method, but use a mix of methods, and that they not just measure the ethics of the organization and its ethical culture, but also even audit it, or also do it not just once, but monitor it, sometimes even on a real-time basis. Well, to finish my presentation, what are the takeaways? Well, I want to offer you 4 takeaways based on those 4 questions and those 4 answers. As said, regarding the first question, the ethical culture of your organizations are the perceptions of your employees and the patterns in their behavior. So both perceptions and patterns. Well, secondly, it's not just important that regulators define what ethical culture is or scholars define that, but what we expect nowadays from organizations in this field is that they define the dimensions of their own ethical culture. So my question to you is, what are the dimensions of your ethical culture? How would you define the ethical culture of your organizations? And thirdly, well, it's also not based on scientific research that we can say what the business cases of measuring ethical culture, but especially also to build it up for yourself. So why should we measure the ethical culture of our organization? What is the benefits for that? And how can we use that to convince boards and other stakeholders? And one of the ladies will also speak about that in a few minutes. And finally, also, I believe it's crucial that that organizations have a well-considered approach, well thought out approach of measuring ethical culture. So when to measure, what, by whom, and how. Well, that's it. I hope this presentation was useful for you. Thank you for your attention, and it's now up to Alison.
Thank you very much, Muel, and Alison, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Muel. And what I'll focus on here is thinking about the how to measure and putting that in the context of the approach that we use at the FSCB, which is one approach, I would stress, one approach among many, but just to share some thoughts there. But just to start off with a couple of thoughts that just sprang to me thinking about what Muel was saying. I mean, measurement can clearly have a very strong demonstrative aspect. Important also that we keep in mind, and this is something I'll come back to when talking about our approach, measurement isn't the end point, it's the means to the end. So when we're thinking about how and what to measure, starting point is always, what is the information that we're looking for? And this is information that by definition other people hold and that we want them to give to us because they know something and it's valuable. We actually want that. So the form has to follow what we're trying to obtain. So it's always starting off with thinking, what is the information that we need? Secondly, measurement and monitoring is not management. So measurement helps us to manage by enhancing our understanding. Now we can measure without understanding, and we can certainly understand without measuring, but bring them together. And as Ian suggested at the intro, this is where the magic happens. This is where you get iterative and reinforcing approach of gathering the data, interpreting, being able to get more data on the back of that to get a better understanding and so forth. And finally, the importance, I think, always of keeping the bigger picture in mind. It's very easy once we start to think about measurement to sort of fixate on one strand or one number. But you can, as we can all imagine and possibly know, you can have great engagement scores in an organization that puts its clients and customers last and behaves very unethically. You can have a very strong corporate purpose and actually a really bad corporate purpose. You can have high passion and empathy and really high rates of burnout. Or you could have personal development opportunities and everyone too scared to speak up. So when we're thinking about what we measure when it comes to culture, it's always thinking about how to cast the net quite widely, which is why, of course, this is quite a difficult area to pin down. So how can we go about it? So thinking first about how to measure, building here on some things that Muel said, and then coming to give you some of the sort of practical examples from how we try and do this at the FSCB. Variety of approaches, as Muel said, some observational, indirect. We've used ethnography, we've used language analysis, you can do text analysis, you can do network analysis, or you can ask directly, what are people's subjective responses? So coming back to that point I mentioned at the beginning, what is the information that other people have that you need? What's the question that we want answered? Is it about their engagement? Is it about outcomes? Is it about problems? Is it about individual values? Is it about how happy they are? What is it that we're trying to gauge here? Secondly, who has that information? Who do we need to ask? Everybody in an organization? Some people in an organization, particular groups, particular grades, particular times at the firm, whatever? Do we need statistically valid sets of people? Do we want sets of people who are comparable to sets of people in other organizations or in other business areas? So who is it that you want to ask who has the information that you need. Then how to ask. Is it through a survey? Is it through focus groups? Is it through interviews? How often do you need to ask them? Is this a one-off? Is it something that you need to check frequently? But whatever approach, whoever it is you ask and however we ask, needing to think all the time, am I making this as safe as possible for people to answer? You know, if this is confidential, and many things will be, and many of these approaches will be, is that clear and is it correct? Is it confidential? If I have a lot of demographic questions to ask, well, maybe I put those at the end and make them optional. You know, so make this a safe place to be honest. It goes without saying in a sense, but we want the questions to be as unbiased as possible. And there are some things that we know from the research. You know, average question scores tend to go up with the length of the question and the length of the survey, and the range of responses tends to become smaller. So keep the questions as short as you can. And the tendency to agree to questions tends to go up as you go through a survey as well. So try and mix up the positive and negative questions. We often get comments back with the FSCB survey, there's a lot of negative questions in there. Actually, there aren't. There's about equal proportions positive and negative. But most surveys, and certainly most engagement surveys, will tend to be very leaning towards the positive. It helps to have the mix. And be straightforward in the questions. Test them, do cognitive testing. A question may make sense to you because you've designed the question and you know what you're looking for, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's simple to answer or easy to understand for anybody else. And coming back to that point of sort of means and ends, if your end point is to get high survey scores, then, you know, have a very long survey, have positively phrased questions, put the most important questions to the end and encourage teams to compete in getting the best scores. But if you actually want useful data, then ask in a way that's best designed to give you useful data and not the best chance of avoiding awkward results. So think about what the end point is and structure the questions in that way. And finally, analysing. The best designed survey will not answer questions it wasn't intended to ask. And you can only turn data into information if we interpret it in the right way, recognising also the limitations of a survey approach, because it is a limited tool. It's useful in its context, but it's not a magic answer to everything. So I'll come back to this in the context of the FSCB's own work. And also you want that information to be used. You want it to have staying power. So for that, it has to be owned by the board, which I know is something that Oonagh is going to be particularly talking about, but also sort of owned in a sense by everybody. You know, so where it's appropriate, share the results, you know, say how we're going to respond. Otherwise, why would anyone bother to give you the information in the first place? There's a reciprocal bargain here. We need information, you need information, a survey, people give you it, but it has to be useful. So the organisation as a whole needs to be aligned on the value of the exercise and on this being a way towards continuous improvement. From wherever you are, however good your starting point, however bad your starting point, this is about how we continue to get better and compete and become, you know, a better functioning organisation. So as one example, and stress it is only one example, the FSCB approach, what do we set out to measure in the first instance? So we're looking at measuring aspects of workplace culture. So we're looking at group behaviour. We're not focusing on individual values, moral identity. We're looking at the group behaviour. We have approached this in a number of ways. We've used interviews, focus groups, indirect information gathering in sense of scenarios, simulations and behavioural trials, but a consistent element of this over the years. We've run this now for 6 years. We've just started actually, the 7th annual cycle has been a survey. Survey here is of employees. What is the information we're looking for in the survey? This is a really interesting one in the context of group culture, because clearly every organisation is going to be different in its culture. Every organisation that around this virtual table that we are part of will be different. Different leadership, different composition of employees, different environment it operates in, different history. Some cultures will be very tight with, you know, very clear social norms, others will be much looser. Different on an oil rig to a startup, different on a trading floor to a retail branch to the internal audit. And that culture needs to flex as the organisation develops and the environment changes. You know, culture isn't a skeleton, it's a nervous system or a blood flow, whatever you like to describe it. It moves, it changes, it adapts. When we are measuring and thinking, you know, is a culture a good culture? What we're thinking of is good outcomes. It's not a particular type of culture. It's not a template of a culture. A good culture produces good outcomes. And in our terminology, it produces good outcomes for customers and clients and for society as a whole, which for current purposes, I would say is absolutely consistent with an ethical culture. I saw one of the questions in the chat, you know, we have to measure risk cultures, ethical cultures, whatever. Our focus is we're thinking, what is a good culture? It's good outcomes for the people that the financial services sector serves in both a narrow definition of customers, clients, and a wide definition of society. Lots and lots of different ways of having a good culture, myriad of ways of having a really bad culture. What do we actually measure? What we try to measure are things that help us judge those different cultures. And if we could just go to the first slide, please. So the template that you can see there, these are the characteristics that we say in our approach are associated with good outcomes. Things like honesty, reliability, competence, resilience, as you can see on the chart there, on the premise that if these characteristics are demonstrated to a high degree within a firm, that firm is probably better motivated and better equipped to deliver good outcomes for customers, clients than one that isn't. Who do we ask? We ask the people that know the firm best from the inside, the employees. We ask, we need statistically valid numbers of responses in the different business areas to allow us to say with some confidence, this is what people are seeing in the firm. How do we ask? 36 core questions, 36 Likert questions, Likert scale questions ranging strongly agree, strongly disagree, mix of negative, positive, presented in different orders, randomly distributed. We test the questions. We have kept the question set consistent over the years so we can measure changes over time. And we also have a core free text question, which is just 3 words. What do you think of? How do you describe your firm? And interestingly, those text questions, when we went into the COVID lockdown, changed hugely, you know, so the free text is as interesting as the core sort of disagree, agree questions. The precise questions, I haven't put them on the slide because they would be almost invisible, they were so small, but they are available on our website if anyone would like to look at them. Most of them are phrased in terms of what people see happening around their organization. We know the research tells us we generally think as individuals that we are more clever, more rational, more ethical than average, than people on average are. We all have our blind spots. So rather than asking, you know, how confident do I feel in doing something or whatever, we say, what do you see, you know, others in your team, others in your organization? So we ask people to talk about what they see around the organization. We will also ask alongside these consistent core questions every year, a small number of additional questions, digging into particular areas we're interested in. These have covered in the past areas such as inclusion, new ways of working, and if we just go to the next slide, speaking up. And what you can see here on the slide, I'm not going to go into the sort of the results themselves. I'm very happy if anyone wants to get in touch afterwards and we can talk about those. But just to give you a sense of the type of narrative we can draw out with particular questions, springing from the core questions in the set, but going into more detail, you know, if you did want to speak up, what was it about? If you didn't want to speak up, why? What was it about? And we can sort of, you know, you can do little sort of trails of these questions to try to build up a picture of particular aspects that we're interested in. Interpreting and analysing the results, this is critical. We don't provide firms with a single score in the sense we don't aggregate across those different characteristics of honesty, reliability, competence, and so forth that I mentioned. I don't think you can sensibly bunch these together. And as boards, as firms, as leadership teams, as managers, what you want to do is to actually get that broad picture. This is about reaching a judgment. It's not about winning a poll. This is about trying to sort of understand what's happening in different dimensions, in different areas of the firm. Because the survey questions are consistent, we can look at the results over time. Those can be compared within a firm, one business area compared with other business areas. And because we're asking the same question set across different firms, with the same business areas in other firms. So how do the results in risk and compliance compare with risk and compliance everywhere else? How do the results in retail branch, if in banking, compare with other retail branch and so forth? And the interesting thing here is it's where do the changes, where do the differences come in? Where is a business area moving in a different direction to other business areas in my firm, or differently to all the other business areas across other organizations? And then where are others doing things? Maybe their scores are much better. Maybe I'm, a bit of an outlier here. So there are things there that are telling me I can learn something from these other organizations. So which then gives you sort of action from that survey data. The other area that we're looking at increasingly, because we have the numbers in terms of number of responses to be able to do so, is looking at different demographic groups, looking at intersectionality. And this is where you get the real value of multi-firm data, because you don't run into the small number problem as quickly as you might within most organizations. And if we just look to the next slide, just thinking here about inclusion, again, this is just an example. I'm not going to go into the results here, but just taking it down to one level, thinking about how a question on inclusion, how do I feel I belong within my organization? How do I feel I can be accepted? How do I feel I can be myself? How that varies by different groups within the organization. Because what you're looking for in the results, it's not the average, it's not 85% of people feel X, it's actually how are different groups and different individuals feeling within my organization. As we go along, as we've built up this data over 6 years, coming to 7th year now, obviously our work has been developing. We've moved, as Ian mentioned in the intro, from looking at banks now to opening up to financial services across the sector. And we're also about to bring in a new category of where we can work with firms outside financial services in an associate category. All this about trying to think how we look at culture widely and just bring as much information into the picture as possible. But on the data, a couple of things I'll just flag here. One is we're going back to try to look at this first thing, this premise that all this is based on, that this should be linked to better outcomes for customers to clients. So with that data set, trying to look at the links between what's measured and outcomes, particularly from the point of view of cultural cohesion and fragmentation within an organisation, and links here with prudential risk and business and conduct outcomes. So that's work in progress, so watch that space, and hopefully I'll put something out on that shortly. And particularly focusing on the experience of different groups. I mentioned the intersectionality aspect. We can observe culture across a group, but the experience of that culture will be different for every person in it, depending on their characteristics, their own experiences and so forth. So to understand the culture, we really need to understand a jigsaw in which every single piece is cut slightly differently. And for that, we need a big enough data set. It's very hard for organizations on their own, but when we can look across firms, we can start to see some of those pictures. So for example, something we found consistently in the survey over the years is that women tend to answer questions more positively than men on most questions. And going back to that question on belonging, that's particularly evident there. But when we dig deeper and we say, okay, here we have gender, and now let's bring in ethnicity alongside it, what we find is that white men are, for example, 13% less likely than white women to feel that they belong. Men from other ethnic minority groups, and for this purpose of this, I'll bunch these other groups together, are 35% less likely than white women to feel they belong. And women from ethnic minority groups, other ethnic minority groups, are 39% less likely than white women. So you have to start to look at those layers, and that's just bringing two characteristics together. And clearly there are many more here that we could factor in. So how can we really dig into this to help us think what is the most useful information to extract from survey data to really help us understand, help us manage, help us lead organizations, how we use this data intelligently. And with that, Ian, I will pause there and pass over to Oonagh, who I think is also going to talk about how boards and others actually learn and use data like this. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alison. And Oonagh, over to you.
Thank you, Ian. And well, that was fascinating. Thank you very much, Alison, for that really rich insight into the challenges of measuring culture. And for Muel, really lovely to see that research on how much value we can get for the business. So I will start with the board, because culture starts in the boardroom. Next slide, you'll see, why do we focus on culture in the boardroom? 3 reasons. I was that young chief executive thinking I could deliver all the goals in the strategy, And I was a mathematician and economist, and I measured everything. But I suddenly woke up and realized it wasn't just about our strategy, and it wasn't about the numbers. It was about our people. And it was about our culture. And that started me on this journey 30 years ago. And as we've learned, you know, it's also about reputational risk. If your culture isn't working, things will happen, and those crises can wipe millions off your share value. And in the worst cases, of course, your survival depends on it. So, as we see from Bob Garrett's books on the next slide, culture is also important in the boardroom, because the fish does rot from the head, and it's the board's job to stop that rot. Bob Garrett has worked his lifetime to help boards be more effective. And the good news is that there is now a new generation of non-execs emerging in the boardroom who are asking much more questions about culture. So what I'm going to do today, on the next slide, you'll see, is two things. I'm going to start with, well, what is it boards actually do? How do we govern culture? And then what information do we need to govern culture better? And I can't pretend I have all the answers, because as Ian said, you know, this work is relatively new and it's early days, but as Alison has showed, and Muel, we need to do it. And there's lots of good data out there. So I'll wrap up with some conclusions. So let's come to the next slide. Just a quick reminder of what do we do in the boardroom? Well, everyone thinks we just make decisions. We do make decisions, and I've tried to capture here the decisions we make. We've got three main things we have to do. We set the purpose, the values, and the culture, and agree the strategy. So it's the stewardship of the business is our job. But then we have to also hold the executive to account to make sure they're actually doing it. And here are a number of ways we do. But then we're also having to assure not just investors these days, as everyone has said, but regulators, our own people, the wider public, and even those, we can't assure the environment, but we can assure people that we're taking care of the environment. And in these days of what we're calling ESG, but particularly with all the crises we're facing in the world, our culture matters everywhere, in everything we do. So well, before I go to the next slide, just one thing. I remember speaking to a chairman of a very well-known company early on, and he said, yes, but the most important thing we do, our job, is to support the chief executive and the CEO and his team to be the best they can be, because they've got to deliver the strategy and keep us in focus on our purpose and our values and our culture. They've got a huge job to do. And our job as a board is to support and challenge them to do that as well as they possibly can. And I say that because when we come to the next slide, you see culture does start in the boardroom and how we ask questions. Back 10 years ago now, I was asked to join a little group after the global financial crisis that the Lord Mayor had put together to look at how could we restore trust and integrity in the city. And I was very lucky to be asked to lead some work on how boards govern culture. So I got to find answers best I could from 60 chairmen, chief executives, directors, to learn how they were doing it. And then that was the first stage, was looking in the city, and then we looked out much more widely across all businesses. And the Financial Reporting Council set up a culture coalition, which brought everyone together, and we revised and updated our guide. And I think, Alex, could you just flick back a couple of, yeah, that's it. And yeah, so what we realized was we've got a whole system problem, because on the outside here is businesses exist to create value for everyone, not just investors, but these days it has to be for the planet and people. And what drives that is the board's culture and the organizational culture, as Muel said so well as individual behavior. And every day, anyone, anywhere in our business contractors as well as employees can destroy that value overnight. So board leadership is at the heart of this and is central, but we have to be aware of all of those consequences. And so what we found with this research was there were really six areas where boards need to focus their attention. So the first, and Alex just got it, is inspiring. You know, is our purpose really inspiring to everyone? Because it's the inspiring purpose that will motivate people to be their best, because that's why they're there. And we also need to make sure, next one, Alex, that the strategy is aligned with our purpose. Lots of strategies, unfortunately, these days are really 3-year plans, and they're about making more money for the investors in the worst case. So the best boards are asking, okay, but how will this help our people? What are we going to do about our people, particularly with Great Resignation? And how are we going to take care of the environment? Are we meeting our ESG commitments as well? So aligning is critical. The third piece we need to worry about is, are we promoting and embodying the culture we want? Is the boardroom a place where the conversation is safe for all the executives to speak up and the non-execs who've got difficult questions to ask? Are we encouraging the kind of behavior in the executives that we want to see in the whole business? And how do we know that everyone is behaving that way in the organization? But it starts at the top. The next one is, are we guiding decision making? So this is codes of conduct, of course, and lots of other ways we guide decision making. The best companies have very good ethical dilemma training, where they're training everyone in the business to be ethically fit. And the next thing we can do, and we need to be vigilant about, is how we encourage behavior through what we reward and what we incentivize. I've spent some time in government. In government, reward doesn't get you very far, because no one can earn more than the Prime Minister. And if you're in the legal section of the government legal department, for example, you can't earn very much compared to what your peers from university may be earning in the city. And yet people stay. So they stay because they're encouraged and inspired by the purpose, and because they're encouraged by a whole load of other things that can happen around the individual. And I think Muel was speaking a bit about that in terms of, you know, what is the proposition for our employees? It isn't just about the money. And the last one is assuring ourselves. So every day in the boardroom, we have to assure ourselves, where's the evidence that this is actually happening? And we have to assure all those stakeholders as best we can. And I particularly like to point to the work that KPMG has been doing recently with its impact website, because more and more KPMG is trying to see how can we measure this and how can we evidence it, and put all of that on the website, from the codes of conduct to the commitment to social equality in the business, and where we are now and where we want to be. And I think that assurance, you know, it has to be, it's inside out and outside in, isn't it? We have to be very transparent with everyone. So let's go on to the next slide, because boards have lots of questions. And when we come to measuring culture, the measures we want need to be answering the kind of questions we're asking. And this is where I think some of the disconnect comes between the information we get and what we really need. So here I thought I'd give you just a few questions that we might be asking in the boardroom, in the best boards. I hasten to say not every board is doing this. And I'm not saying this is KPMG by any means, because that wouldn't be fair. I'm referring to many boards I work with and advise, and we all ask questions everywhere. So these are the best questions I hear people asking. But how do we actually get measures that will answer these questions? Alison's spoken a lot about surveys and their strengths and weaknesses, but surveys can answer certainly this first one: how inspired are our people by our purpose and values? But as she said, these are subjective measures, they're a moment in time. If we look at the third question, we can see other types of measures we get in the boardroom, which are outcome measures. Are we attracting and retaining the talent we need to succeed? Most boards will be getting that data now, and they're measures of outcome. But boards will follow up when the numbers aren't the way we want them. Well, if we don't, why not? What's going on? And then we might look at indicators. And indicators might be, well, what does the diversity and inclusion data look like? Are we treating people consistently and fairly, no matter what their protected characteristics? How do we know? And if so, what are you doing about it, dear executive? Is it working? So this is where we're looking for more evidence. We're looking to see, is the executive on top of this? Have they got an idea of what's going on? Have they got answers? Can they tell us with confidence? Are we confident that they really do know what's going on and what we need to be doing? So I think we need data, or we need data interpreted, as Alison said, but the information we need is a number of different things. And if we go to the next slide, I've tried to capture some of the richness and also myriad of culture data and measures that are out there. These are only a few. And what I've learned over the years and put into practice myself in other places is the value of creating dashboards where we have a lot of the key parts of this data all on one page, so we can see what is it that, where are things going well or not. You'll see I've included here customer and supplier data, which I think is also very valuable because they have an experience of the organization that is different to ours, and it stops us getting stuck in our own assumptions and mindsets about our own business. What's it like for those people who are experiencing us on the outside? What I've also seen work really well, I mean, one of the questions on that previous slide, which is what we asked a lot of chairmen, was how do you sleep at night knowing that at any one time 5–10% of your organization is misbehaving? And those who had thought about this said, well, what we need to know is, do the executive know who those people are? And if we do know who they are, why is it? It won't just be individual ethics, as Muel said, it'll be the organization, it'll be the organizational culture that's guiding and encouraging either the best behavior or the wrong behavior. So what I've seen again in the best companies, if you're tackling that issue, is that I remember one risk director saying to me, we've got together with HR and finance, because between us, we know who's consistently misbehaving across lots of things. So together, our board has said to us, unless we can tell them that we've identified at least 40 of our 400,000 employees every month, then we're not doing our job. And so we have to be on top of that. So those are just a quick overview, and I'm happy to get into specifics, but it's early days and the data is complex. Even the dashboards are very difficult to interpret. In the boardroom, you know, I'm about to read a massive board pack. I don't have the time to understand, you know, if I'm just told, well, speak up reports have gone up this month. Is that good? Is it bad? How does it compare with last year? It could be because one bit of the business has got a real problem and the speak up reports have rocketed. It could be that on average, the campaign we've been doing across the business has been working and people feel more confident to speak up, or they've remembered they could speak up and so they are. We need context if we're to interpret the data we're given. We need real information, and we need the knowledge of people like you who can help us understand what we're looking at. So coming to the next slide, I think one of the challenges for everyone is that measuring culture is really hard, as Alison and Muel have shown us. We have to look at the whole system, how everything interacts with everything else. And there is no one metric. In the boardroom, you know, it's easy to look at the bottom line. Why aren't we making more profit? Why isn't the revenue going up? It's a lot harder to look at culture. I think another problem is that, you know, when I look back to the global financial crisis, by then people have got the message about values, and we had them plastered all over our walls and websites, but still people were misbehaving. And it was, those were critical misbehaving that actually brought down the global almost brought down the global financial system. So I think when I thought about it more, you know, when you think about it, it's as much about who do you value and what you value as how you value. So do we value profit more than people or more than the environment? And these days, most boards value all three and are struggling all the time with all of them. So in the boardroom, we're making very difficult ethical decisions often, and it's a constant balancing act and adjustment to make sure that we're looking after our people and the planet and profit. So values really, I think, can only best be measured by looking at behaviours rather than people's perceptions, asking them, what would you do in this situation? What do you do? What does the organisation encourage you to do? But then we're into the area of measurement I haven't spoken about, no one has, but the very, I think, particularly good work that's being done by the likes of Culture Scope to really get into the soil, the underlying soil, the fundamental behaviours of individuals and organisations and how that's changing. As I said, boards use dashboards, but they need a lot of interpretation. So if we could come to the last slide to sum up. I think when we measure culture, we have to think about the boardroom first and what matters to the board. So if you're making a business case, the business case will be about the reputation, the strategy and the survival of the business or any organisation, because I work across government, government and charities and businesses. Boards govern culture through their stewardship and accountability and assurance. All of those matter to them, but culture is really hard to measure. The measures we need to be relevant to the kind of questions we're asking and contextualized and interpreted for us. So it's important that boards, that you understand, I think, where we're starting from, and that boards are clear about which of the 6 areas they need to be vigilant about. And finally, just keep up the good work. Crises happen, and they're a great opportunity for you to pull out that data you've been collecting for years, interpret it for the board or the executive and show them just how you can help and where the problem might be. Thank you.
Oonagh, thank you very much. And thanks also to Alison and Muel. Some fascinating insights, I think, there, and lots to think about and indeed to discuss. Now, our time is limited, so I'm going to plough straight into questions. I'm going to ask colleagues to keep their answers as brief as possible so that we can get through as many as possible. I will just take the sort of chair's prerogative to make one observation, and I think it came out in all the presentations, but Oonagh, you particularly made the point about, you know, looking at those different indicators, you know, which ones give us the best insights. And so 2 observations. One is some of the questions refer to subjective versus objective, the difficulty of gaining hard data. You know, can you really measure culture? And I have to say, whilst I understand why people ask the question, I think we sometimes spend too much time worrying about that. You know, one way or another, we've got to assess this. If we can't assess it, then we can't do anything about it. We can't act upon it. So we need to work out which indicators give us the greatest insight. And I think boards need to discuss that. And so they need our advice, yeah, but also we want the board's view on what they need. And too often, I think, boards don't take enough interest in that, and then they're not sure how to handle the detail. And when it comes to, as Oonagh, you rightly said, you know, speak up data, is it a good thing if speak up data is going up, or is it a bad thing if speak up data is going up? And of course, it depends, doesn't it, on what's the driver behind that. Is it because there are more things going wrong, which is a bad thing, or is it because people now feel more comfortable to speak up and raise their issues, which has to be a good thing from a culture point of view? So, you know, lots of issues to think about. Now, I'm gonna pile into the questions, and we're going to go through them as quickly as we can. So the first one that came up was really about, shouldn't we be defining a single culture that delivers all of the organization's ambitions, delivery of strategy, being compliant, ethical, living the values? Observed many wanting to measure a diversity culture or a safety culture. I think, Alison, you touched on this, didn't you? Do you want to comment any further on that?
No, I have a huge amount of sympathy with the question, because, you know, we often come across this as well. I mean, as I mentioned, we have this very sort of simple approach, which is we take a good culture has good outcomes for customers, clients, society. Now, within that, as I mentioned, you know, we're looking at a range of aspects. Even just within the survey, there's, you know, a whole range of characteristics there. Different parts of businesses will look at different angles, but I think it's quite difficult to have a good risk culture if you don't have a good ethical culture, if you don't have, you know, focus on diversity and all of these types of things. So I think there is a lot of overlap, and it's almost different perspectives on the same thing. Again, it's what is it you're focusing on? What are you targeting the questions towards? But as long as you're keeping it in the context of that bigger picture and different aspects. But I do think we often overcomplicate things for ourselves in this space, actually, when we're analysing and talking about this.
Okay, thanks, Alison. Yvonne asks, how do we define or know what is ethical culture? Gosh, I think I could probably have a go at this, but I'm not going to, because I'm not on the panel. But as you would expect from the IBE, we have a view, and actually quite deliberately entitled this event ethical culture, not just culture or business culture, quite deliberately, because I think, you know, that's often one of the things that we do overlook, is what this is about, is how we behave ethically. I'll give you a clue. The clue is purpose and values. Does our culture reinforce our purpose and values, enable us to deliver on our purpose and values? Now, obviously, you could have very unethical purpose and very unethical values, but I think what most of us think about with purpose and values is you know, those values that drive the way we run the business. Oonagh, what's your view on this?
Well, I think it's quite simple. You know, it's do unto others as you would do unto yourself. And that's as true whether you're a company and how you treat your suppliers and your customers, as much as when you're a company supplying to others and being a customer to others. I think it works for everyone. And of course, yeah, I think that's enough. That's my quick, short answer.
Muel, I'll give you the chance to give a view on this one as well, I think.
Yeah, I would start by the fact that most organizations nowadays have a code of ethics or a business code of conduct or their business principles. So that's what they have defined themselves as being ethical and unethical. So when I would be a board member or an ethics or a compliance officer or whomever, I would take that as starting point because that's defined by the organization as ethical. And I would say, well, what's the culture regarding all those norms that are stipulated in that code that are desirable? And then you can go for, say, the full code, and that refers, by the way, to the previous question, say, ethics in all its dimensions, or you can focus on, say, for example, safety or diversity or competition, fair competition, or whatever. So I would not come up with a definition from, say, academic work or a very general one, because then it's very difficult for people in the organization and even outside what is ethical. But I would keep it simple as possible. Start by the code of ethics the organization has defined for itself.
Yeah, and the code, of course, should be very reflective of the purpose and values of the organisation.
Yeah, but also its standards, also its norms, also its guidelines. So, of course, purpose, values, but also maybe more specific.
So the point here really is, how do we define or know what is ethical? Well, we need to work that out. It's a responsibility of the board to work that out. Nobody's going to tell them, and nobody should tell them. It's their decision. It's nobody else's decision. However, of course, they have to make that decision in the context of stakeholders and stakeholders' views. So none of us, is sitting here in splendid isolation. We need to think about, well, if we believe those are our ethical values, what will others think of that? Really interesting question. We could spend all day on that, but we won't because we haven't got the time. Right. Martin Westerman mentions that interesting that financial performance also gets a lift. This is, I think, looking at your slides, Muel, of 13%, or measuring ethical culture. That relation has always been presumed, but apparently it can now be proven. Can you shed some light on how that relationship was proven? Is it causal effect or mere correlation?
Yeah, a lot of research has been done that shows a correlation. But then the question is, what comes first? Maybe first your financial performance, and then you have money, time available to pay attention and to improve your ethics. But this is really regression based. So first, the investment in ethics, building up an ethical culture, and then comes the financial benefits. So good question of Maarten, and the question is very promising indeed. Yeah.
And another question from Martin, which I'm going to aim at Alison, which was really about speak up. It says, amazing and a bit sad that despite our best efforts and reassurances to colleagues, primary reason for not reporting ethical concerns is about retaliation. And a recent survey we did at the IBE showed that of those that spoke up, 43% experienced retaliation. So it clearly is a very real concern. Alison, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is such one of my, I think this is such a really interesting area. And actually just picking up on Julian's question as well, this is where we need to bring in the quant and the qual. I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for Julian's point there that I don't think you can measure culture directly, but there are things you can measure that help you gauge it. And this is particularly so when we come to this aspect. So yes, Martin, absolutely. What we find is that what we sort of loosely badge fear and futility, we get about equal percentages saying, I didn't speak up because I was afraid of what would happen. And I didn't speak up just because there's no point, is there? Because nothing ever happens when I do. And this is where I think you get the real value, again, coming back to what information do I need to help me, to help me really take effective action on this in terms of following the story through, because a lot of organizations quite rightly think, do I have a whistleblowing line? Do people feel safe to speak up? Now we know that substantial proportions still don't, but actually they may feel safe, but they may see no point in doing so because there's no response. So it's thinking both about the safety side and the responsiveness side. And just linking up to a question which was asked further down, I think it was Malcolm saying, do people give a reason for this? That's the sort of thing where we need to think of different approaches to making people feel safe enough to share that information. So probably it's not a survey approach there, but what we can do there is we start with the findings of the survey, drill in, maybe it's focus groups, maybe there's other ways of picking up this information, but also working on the responsiveness side and indeed on the fear side, because often the concern over consequences relates to stories and things that people have heard, which may not even be at current time, but that becomes part of the fabric of the firm, part of the narrative of the firm. And you can't delete those stories, but you have to overwrite them with good examples. And what has a real effect on what we've seen coming through lots of times in focus group discussions is where you have people in authority, influencers, leaders, who will say, yes, I got that wrong. This is how we're going to fix it. And I realized I got that wrong because someone pointed this out to me or told me. If there are examples where people can say, we really benefited from this, I as a leader, we as an organization, because people said something, that changes that narrative again. So it's bringing together the quant and the qual, and this is one of these really big and current areas where you do need both.
Yeah. Oonagh, did you want to come in?
Yes, and I wanted to give an example from KPMG, where it was becoming apparent from the data, you've got to collect the data, that we were getting too many anonymous speak-ups. And exactly as Alison said, you know, is it the futility or the fear, and figuring that out? But also what they did was, we have hundreds of ethics champions across the business. And we decided it was important to show people that it wasn't futile. And we took real examples and we showed how the firm had, you know, really listened. So the campaign was, you speak, we listen, we act, and we protect. And that last piece obviously has to be backed up, and was, with a lot of things. And that will be on the new code of conduct when it's published on the impact site.
Okay, thanks. Nikki Clayton, the struggle is getting access to all the relevant data points, as most departments like to keep them close to their chest. How do you overcome those barriers to sharing? Who am I going to ask this of? I think I'm going to go to Alison.
Why could I see that one coming? Yeah, it is. This can be a tough one, and there isn't an easy way around it. I mean, if there is a way of, you know, you're trying to make this a common goal, so it's not one where you have one area of business competing with another area of business, because that will naturally make those areas and the individuals defensive, particularly if there's data which isn't going to make them look good. So how is this a shared challenge across the business? Are there leaders, influencers who can sort of step out there with a good example in the first instance? Is there a way that actually, you know, you'll be missing out on something by not putting your data into the mix? And also, are there areas in that business where there are things that they're doing really well, actually, instead of harnessing that, you know, competitive spirit to a good end? This isn't, you know, this isn't just a way of, we want to embarrass you by here's a bad report card. Actually, the stuff that other areas of the business can learn from you as well. So if there's one area that you're trying to get information from, are there actually other areas to sort of collect it from as well? But the main thing that does this is leadership by example. So can you show others who are sharing their own data? And maybe it's not all great, you know, in relative terms. But again, this is because it's useful. It's not a report card marking exercise. This is value to the organisation as a whole. It's a learning exercise.
Very good point. Great. Sorry, Muel, go ahead. Yeah.
Now, and to add to that, that was also the reason that I said, well, I think organizations should think first about their measurement approach. So when you have come up with a measurement approach, so what to measure, when to measure, which KPIs, what methods, and then you can go to the department and ask for data points, because then it's not just an open question. No, then it's relevant and hopefully decided by the board. This is the data we need to have in order to determine what the current level is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, thank you very much. I'm afraid we're going to have to finish at that point. There are lots of outstanding questions, and I'm really sorry we haven't got them. We will have a look at them, and if we can put some answers out there to you all, perhaps when we publish the video, we'll see what we can do. And what it does show to me is there's a huge amount of interest in this topic. It's an ongoing area of debate and discussion. There are no single answers to this. It's a discussion that needs to continue. And so what I think we must do at the IBE is continue to support that debate and discussion, and we will run more events on this and hopefully cover more of the issues. So apologies for those of you that asked questions that we've not been able to get to, and we will look to come back to this again. Thank you to our panelists, to Oonagh, to Alison and to Muel. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for your support. Thanks to everybody for attending and participating. And just looking forward, we have IBE training coming up on effective ethics programs. That's at the end of June, so do please take a look at that. Our next webinar, our next online event is The Power of Trust with Sandra Sucher, who is Professor of Management Practice at Harvard Business School. And that's just about to go up on the website. I think it'll be at the end of June. And last to say, there is a feedback survey that we'd love you to fill in. No doubt you'll tell us we didn't answer all your questions and we should have done, and I apologise again for that. Blame the chair, the director of the IBE, it's all my fault. But thanks again for your time, your interest, your commitment, and your questions most of all, and we will endeavour to answer them if we possibly can when we circulate the video recording. Many thanks everybody and have a good day. Cheers, bye-bye.